It is an honor to have Professor Paul Franks, who will deliver his 4-part series on the Ramchal and areas of tshuva. And I'm just going to turn it over to you and just thank you for all your scholarship that you give to the shul. Strength that you'll have, I'm sure, is very well needed in this Elul season, as we just marked Rosh Chodesh Elul, and we are ready for words of wisdom and scholarship that you're going to bring to us. So without further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for being here. I want to dedicate these shiurim to my late mother-in-law, Zichrona Livracha. So it's the Elul Nishmas Shifra Bela Bas Yisrael Yitzhak V'Sara Rivka. I don't think there was ever a shiur that we had here at the Kehilah of Riverdale on Zoom or otherwise that she wasn't at. So very much thinking of her. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Yes. Okay, hopefully this is the right screen, I hope. And so we'll go back and forth between the slides and some questions and answers. So this is a series of 4 shiurim on the work Mesilat Yesharim, Path of the Upright, by Rabbi Moshe Hayyim Luzzatto, known as the Ramchal. And oops, is that coming out right? Yes. Hopefully you can see that. Yes. So I think it's a remarkable thing that Ramchal is almost universally admired and respected now after his lifetime. And if you go back already to the early 19th century, the major trends, the major movements within certainly Ashkenazi Judaism all admired him. So first of all, the Vilna Gaon, by the way, that is the only picture, so far as I know, made of the Vilna Gaon during his lifetime. The Vilna Gaon so admired him that when he read Mesilat Yesharim, he said that a great new light had appeared, and if it were possible, he would walk all the way across Europe to meet the Ramchal and to study at his feet. And the followers of the Vilna Gaon and those particularly involved in the musar movement founded by Rabbi Yisrael Salanter really made the Mesilat Yesharim central to their understanding of ethical improvement. He was also admired by the haskalah, by the Jewish enlightenment. And one early illustration of that is that Reb Shlomo Dubno, who was the close colleague, although they fell out, of Reb Moshe Midessau, also known as Moses Mendelssohn, and at least a forerunner of the haskalah, published one of Ramchal's plays. So in addition to his musar works and his kabbalistic works, which I'm going to get to, he wrote poetry and plays as well, and is seen as one of the great pioneers of Hebrew language, drama, and poetry in the modern period. And then third figure, I can't believe this is an accurate picture. It doesn't look like one to me, but it's what I saw on the web. The Maggid of Mezerich, the pioneer of Hasidism, disciple of the Baal Shem Tov, and in many ways a founder of the actual movement, the Hasidic movement, also admired Ramchal, but for his kabbalistic work, which he advocated the printing of that work, which we'll get to, including Ramchal's very controversial writings. So all of this great admiration is after the death of Ramchal. I want to say a little bit about his life, because we'll see that during his lifetime, he was actually, in the end, hounded and persecuted and regarded as extremely controversial. Although he had some honor given to him, he certainly was not during his lifetime regarded in the same positive manner that he was after his death. He was born in 1707 in Padua, and in those days, of course, they were still ghettos. in the Italian states. He was born to a well-established, wealthy Italian Jewish family of Ashkenazi descent originally. The name Luzzatto comes from a place in Ashkenaz, and he was an excellent student. Now, one of the interesting things about Padua is that it's the home of the medical school of the University of Padua, which was for a long time, starting in the Middle Ages, the only one in Europe that admitted Jews. Eventually, the University of Leiden also admitted Jews. So at a very young age, in 1723, Ramchal enrolled in the School of Medicine. And we have the record of his registration, his matriculation, but he never graduated. Nevertheless, he clearly had the other languages, the Latin and so on, that he would have required to undertake studies there. And his friends were drawn from the students at the University of Padua who had come from all over the Jewish world. And again, at a very young age, in 1724, he published his first book, which was highly regarded. And this is one of the books that makes him beloved by the haskalah, by the Jewish enlightenment. It's called Lashon Limudim. It's about Hebrew language, rhetoric, and poetry. 1725, he was given smicha. He was ordained as a rabbi, but things really took a turn in 1727. At the age of 20, he began to experience a heavenly voice known as a Maggid. And this Maggid, among other things, dictated to him new kabbalistic works, the most important of which were in the style of the Zohar. So he wrote what was known as Zohar Tinyana, a sort of second or a further volume of the Zohar, and Shivim Tikkunim. There is important work called Tikkunei Zohar, which is 70 kabbalistic explanations of the first verse of the Torah. And the Maggid dictated to Ramchal 70 kabbalistic explanations of the last verse of the Torah. Now, at this time, there was a confraternity, as scholars call it, a group of young men, some of whom were from the university, who gathered together in order to devote themselves to Kabbalah. And he joined this group. It was called Mavakshe Hashem, those who seek God. But soon it relocated to his house, and he became the center of the group. And this confraternity was directed by him at this point, and it was engaged in the work of salvation, basically bringing the Mashiach in accordance with what the Maggid, this heavenly voice, was telling Ramchal to do. And in 1729, unfortunately, one of his fellow members of this group, Yekusiel Gordon of Vilna, made a major strategic error. He decided to publicize just how great Ramchal was. So he wrote letters to some of the major rabbis in Ashkenaz, starting with the Rabbi Yaffa in Vienna, about how Ramchal was amazing and what they were doing in Padua was going to bring the Mashiach. This set off the alarm bells. And you have to remember that it was not that long since the debacle of Shabtai Tzvi, who had declared himself, had been declared the Mashiach. Many of those in the Jewish world, throughout the Jewish world, had followed him. And then, of course, he, as you may know, ultimately presented himself to the Sultan and was then, instead of receiving the land of Israel, in order to reestablish the Jews there, he was told to convert to Islam or die, and he chose to convert to Islam. That did not go as planned. And at that point, there was, I would say, the movement split into different parts. Some people were just disillusioned and they went back to what they were doing before. Some people retained some attachment to Shabtai Tzvi personally, but they went back to the way they were acting before. Others, the most extreme, followed him into conversion to Islam, but secretly they were leading a Jewish or a Sabbatean life as members of a sort of a cult. that had its own rituals, some traditional Jewish rituals, but some versions which were Sabbatean in character. And then there were also Jews who were crypto-Sabbateans spread throughout the Jewish world. And a number of rabbis devoted themselves to hunting down these dangerous heretics. Maybe the most famous is Moshe Hayyim. There's an excellent book about him by Elisheva Carlebach. And he tracked down various figures who he exposed as Sabbateans and sort of organized campaigns against these people, thinking that they were very dangerous. So when he hears from this Rabbi Jaffa in Vienna that a guy in Padua is pretty much putting himself and his group forward as bringing the Mashiach, and who knows what they're up to, he decided this was a dangerous business. I won't go into all the details. It's quite complicated story, goes back and forth. And Ramchal's teacher, Rabbi Yeshaya Bassan, was trying to defend him, but it was not easy. Ramchal didn't really make it easy. He was not really prepared to make concessions or back down in any way. And eventually, he was compelled to take a number of oaths, denouncing himself, swearing neither to write nor to teach Kabbalah, and worst of all, to give up his writings for burning or burial. Burial was meant to be a slightly more respectful way of dealing with his writings. Everyone said he himself seemed like a good guy, but this is a terrible path to go down, and therefore they wanted to stop him going down it. So in 1735, he really had enough of all this, and he tries to get away, and he flees to the Spanish-Portuguese community of Amsterdam. And there in Amsterdam, mainly there were refugees from the Iberian Peninsula, people who had been forced converts and who had managed to get away. And they welcomed Ramchal. They were not to be told what to do by other rabbis, and they had their own views, and they had some experience with other people who had been accused of Sabbateanism, whom they had given a home. So they welcomed him. Now, his basic plan, we must remember, had fallen apart. Right? His confraternity in Padua and all the plans that he had with them had to be abandoned. In Amsterdam, he was given a stipend to study and to teach in the equivalent of what we would nowadays call kollel, although it wasn't called that. It was called yeshivat Chaim and various other things. And he also wrote books of musar, of ethics, the most famous of which is Mesilat Yesharim. He wrote it in Amsterdam. And he wrote some more popular expositions of Kabbalah. What he did not do was to write the sorts of works he was writing before that were dictated to him by the Maggid. Although, incidentally, some of those works, against all odds, were saved because apparently Yekusiel Gordon or someone like that brought them back to Vilna, and they survived in Eastern Europe. And some of them were printed later, and some of them more recently. After a period in 1743, he emigrated with his family, made Aliyah to Akko in Eretz Yisrael. And unfortunately, he and his family died in a plague somewhere around 1746-47. So he was a young man. He had achieved a lot, but unfortunately met a rather sad end. But that is his life story. So during his lifetime, persecuted, couldn't really publish what he wanted to publish. This work, Mesilat Yesharim, which is clearly not the thing he really wants to do, but nevertheless, it's what he's able to do, becomes, after his lifetime, it was actually published during his lifetime, and after his lifetime, it became regarded as one of the greatest of all Sifrei Musar, one of the greatest of all ethical works, and his Hebrew style is greatly admired. I think he's comparable to the Rambam in that sense. The Rambam had a clarity of exposition and revived Mishneh Hebrew in order to write the Mishnah Torah. He didn't write that in Judeo-Arabic or in Rabbinic Hebrew. He wrote it in Mishneh Hebrew, and Ramchal is like that. The Vilna Gaon said that he couldn't find a single superfluous word in Mesilat Yesharim. It's a great work in that sense. Let me pause there and see if there are any questions that anybody has or comments. No. Okay, so I'll go on.
Oh,
Hello?
1 second. He'll come.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. We're back. And let's go ahead. Yeah, okay. So this is the from the autograph manuscript, the manuscript in Ramchal's own hand of Mesilat Yesharim, which was published only in the 1990s. It's from the Baron Günzburg collection, which was confiscated by the Soviet state at some point in around 1917, but now through an agreement with the National Library of Israel, it has been microfilmed and then digitized. And this is the very ending where he says, completed on Wednesday, 25th of Elul, 5,498th year of the creation of the world, which would be 1738. Blessed be Hashem forever, Amen, Amen. And then he quotes from the Mizmor, the psalm that we say before blowing the shofar. So we see that he completed this work during Elul, and he regarded it as leading up to Rosh Hashanah. So this is a very appropriate time to study the work. I'll say more about the manuscript in a minute. There was an earlier Hebrew-only edition in the 90s, but in this edition of Mesilat Yesharim, you find the manuscript version as well as the printed version. And originally, the manuscript seems to have been cataloged as an abbreviated version of the printed text, but somebody recognized it because they wrote it down as a draft of Mesilat Yesharim. It's not an abbreviation. It's prior to the printed version. And you can read it online through the National Library's manuscript project, Ketiv. But the most amazing thing is that the manuscript is not at all the same as the printed version. The manuscript is in dialogue form, and it contains material that was left out of the printed version. The manuscript is clearly a complete work, and it was changed. Now, this is not the only time when we have works of Ramchal written in two different forms, dialogue form and treatise form. Nevertheless, it is an interesting question, and we'll come back to it, why it was changed and who changed it. Now, at the core of the work is the Brisa of Reb Pinchas ben Yair, which is in many places in rabbinic literature, but I'm just going to give two of them. There are many different versions. This is the version that will work with his text. And I guess, what I'm looking for here is some indication of what he was up to in writing this work. Here we have someone who is, in the end, a kabbalist, but he's writing a musar work, a work of ethics that makes no explicit reference to Kabbalah at all. What is going on? So the Brisa is at the center of things, and he organizes the whole work around it. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair would say, Torah leads to vigilance, zehirus. Vigilance leads to alacrity, zerizus. Alacrity leads to blamelessness, nikias. Blamelessness of the soul leads to separateness, precious. Separateness leads to purity, tahara. Purity leads to piety, hasidus. Piety leads to humility, anava. Humility leads to fear of sin, yiras chet. Fear of sin leads to sanctity, kedusha. Sanctity leads to the Holy Spirit, ruach hakodesh. the Holy Spirit leads to Techias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. And in this version from the Talmud Bavli and Avodah Zarah, it concludes as follows: and piety, Chasidus, is greater than all of them, as it is stated, then you did speak in a vision to your pious ones. And I think that's actually of some importance. And it's worth noting that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair is a close associate of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is the protagonist of the Zohar. Either he's the son-in-law, sorry, I wrote son-in-law, but either he's the son-in-law or the father-in-law. There are two different versions, depending on whether you look at the Talmud or look at the Zohar. That's not important for our purposes. What's important is that he's very closely connected to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and that would obviously be something that of which Ramchal would be very much aware. Now, in addition to the discovery of the manuscript, another big development in the study of Mesilat Yesharim has been the idea of reading it in a way that exposes its kabbalistic substructure. And one person who certainly gives us the idea for doing this is Rabbi Yerucham Levovitz, who was the mashgiach, the spiritual supervisor at the Mira Yeshiva before the Second World War, when the Mira Yeshiva was still in Europe. And he was, I suppose, a third-generation leader of the musar movement. But these are things that he's reported to have said, and whether he taught it that way is another question that I don't find any evidence that he did. However, I think it's in 1988 that an anonymous work appeared. It's called the Kuntrist Sama Nafshi, and it was published anonymously, although I think people who knew people from the Mir could easily figure out who the person was, but he wants to be anonymous. And this is by a Holocaust survivor, and he describes his tremendous trials and tribulations during the Holocaust and how his family was killed and so on. And he had studied at the Mir Yeshiva before the war. And this seems to be, as far as I know, the first kabbalistic interpretation of Mesilat Yesharim that appeared in print. And more recently, there are some others, and I'll mention one that I found useful, which is the Perish Oros Genuzim by Reb David Tzvi Hoffman. And yes, Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, that's a famous name, but obviously this is someone called after the earlier David Tzvi Hoffman, who was a Hungarian-German rabbi in the late 19th, early 20th century. It's obviously not him. This is a contemporary who's also associated with the Mir Yeshiva. So this is a tradition in the Mir of reading Mesilat Yesharim in a way that exposes its kabbalistic substructure. And Rabbi Yerucham is quoted in his a book that it's really a posthumous book that was put together by his sons and his Talmidim, Das Chochma Musar. Now, the version that I pasted here from the book is slightly different from the way the anonymous author of Tzoma Nafshi reads it. He thinks they put the period in the wrong place. So I'm going to read it the way he did. Right? Kol Abraisa der Pinchas ben Yair, he sowed, full stop. Right, which is not what the Hebrew says, but that's the way it's read. The whole brisa of Reb Pinchas ben Yair is esoteric. It has a mystical or kabbalistic meaning. Malchus me ha-haskalah. Malchus comes first. Hainu ha-Torah mevia. That is the Torah that leads to vigilance and so on and so on. V'chein hala ad ha'anava lefi darchenu, until humility in accordance with our method. I take that to mean that humility is the main goal from the point of view of the Balei Musar, of those within the yeshiva world who are interested in this work as an ethical work. The ad kedusha, and until sanctity, holiness, shehi tachlis hakol yisod hayichud, which is the purpose of the whole, and v'sod hayichud, and the esoteric doctrine of unity. And v'zehu ki Malchus mavila deyichud. So, and in the end, Malchus brings to unity. Sovereignty brings to unity. So there's clearly an idea there that the whole arrangement of the brisa of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, it should be understood in accordance with the spheros. which we will get to next, even though that language is not used by the Ramchal. So let me say a little bit more about that, because there's already a hint to this esoteric meaning of the Brisa of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair in the Maharsha. The Maharsha is a 16th, 17th century commentator on the Talmud, who is, at least at one time, one of the main commentaries to read, but it remains the case, especially with respect to the non-halachic parts of the Talmud. And he discusses it at some length. And he says that this order, he imagines it as the order of a whole day, is what Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair intended when he reckoned here 10 levels in the gradations of the virtues. For thus are his attributes, God's attributes, may he be blessed, according to what is said in Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, Esev lo pachas. So Sefer Yetzirah is a very ancient proto-kabbalistic work that talks about the 10 spheres. It doesn't give us the standard names, that comes a bit later in kabbalistic literature, but it gives us the number 10, and it really emphasizes that the spheres, the manifestations of divine power, are 10 in number. So the Maharsha already in the 17th century said that there are 10 ethical attributes which are discussed by Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, and those correspond to the 10 spheres. Now we have to work that out, because the list that we saw before was of more than 10 things. So just as a reminder or a refresher with respect to the spheres, there are two slightly different ways to get 10 here, right? So if you start from the bottom, we have Malchus, which is kingdom or sovereignty, and Yesod, which is the foundation. And we have on either side of Yesod Netzach and Hod, endurance and splendor. And Yesod and Malchus are in some sort of communicative or copulative connection, right? Then we have the general, very, very schematic structure of a human being, with Tiferes, or beauty, at the center, as a harmonizing center of chesed and gvura, of loving kindness and power. Those attributes, if you regard them either as divine or as human, need to be harmonized. Loving kindness on the one hand, and restraining power on the other. Now, and then Chokhmah and Bina, wisdom and understanding, are two intellectual spheres, but sometimes we have a harmonizing sphere between them as well. It's not part of the canonical 10, but it can be counted, and that's das, that is to say knowledge. Knowledge in the sense of intimate familiarity or intimate awareness. And then at the top, crowning the whole edifice, is Keser, which is crown. So if you don't count the crown, and you can see why you wouldn't count it just from the idea that it's a crown is not part of the body. It is something that is elevated above the head, as it were. Right? So if you don't count Keser, because that is so close to divinity that it shouldn't even be counted in the 10, and it's not really part of the human framework, and you start rather with Chokhmah and Bina, with the two intellectual spheres of wisdom and understanding, then you can also count Das, or intimate knowledge, and then you will get 10. And I think that's the way it goes in the structure of the book. So what we have is an ascent from Malchus, which is kingdom or sovereignty, and that corresponds in this scheme of the book to Torah. In the scheme of the Brisa of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, the first thing that we mentioned is Torah. Torah leads to vigilance, right? So then it's going to go up to Yesod and Hod, vigilance, alacrity, and then blamelessness. And that's the second part of the book, which we'll call the gate of righteousness. So that contains three ethical attributes which correspond to those three spheres, Netzach, Hod, and Yesod. Then we have the gate of piety, and we'll have Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferes, loving kindness, restraining power, and beauty as their harmonization. So that triad is going to characterize the third part of the book. The fourth part is the gate of Kedusha, holiness, or sanctity, and that will correspond to Chachma, Bina, and Das, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And then remember, at the very end of the Brisa, Pinchas ben Yair said, then holiness leads to Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, and Techiyas HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. Now, those are two things that we cannot do ourselves. They are sort of acts of divine grace and recognition of all of our efforts. So that corresponds to Keser, to the crown, and it's the 10. So if we do it that way, I think we'll see that from Torah to Kedusha, we end up with 10. And the whole structure of the book, therefore, corresponds to those spheres. Now, whether those correspondences are exactly correct, we'll have to see when we get through the book. Some commentators think it doesn't quite work the way that I said, which is the way you would expect it to, and we'll have to see if we can make it work or not. But already there's a question, because if you compare the dialogue version with the printed version, which is more familiar to us, you'll find that in the printed version, there's no Torah section at all. And in the dialogue version, there is. What happened to it? The dialogue version is between a chacham, a wise person, who is a Talmid chacham. He is a sort of yeshiva-trained, rabbinically educated person, and a chassid, or a pious person. And they proceed to have a big argument about what chachma is, what wisdom is. And the chacham, the rabbinically educated person, thinks it's obvious wisdom consists in learning all of halacha, learning all of the details of the mitzvahs and what you have to do, and so on, all the sorts of things that you learn in a regular yeshiva, which of course Ramchal knew, and which he's not in any way disparaging, but he doesn't think that's what wisdom consists in. The chassid insists that wisdom consists in fear of God. And he says, this is what you really have to focus your study on. Of course, you also have to study the practical requirements of the mitzvahs, but then you must focus on the requirements of the fear of God. And if you can't give each equal time, then decrease your study of halacha in order to make enough time for your study of chasidus, of piety. That's what it says in the dialogical version. And the Chacham resists because he thinks, fear of God is obvious. We don't need a whole Shulchan Aruch to deal with fear of God. You do what you're supposed to do, and everything else will follow as a matter of course. And the Chassid argues against this. Eventually, the Chacham concedes and agrees to be instructed. So like all of Ramchal's dialogues, it's not really a true dialogue between two equal partners. One side wins. And the Chassid takes over and instructs the Chacham for the rest of the book, and occasionally the Chacham asks questions. In the published version, that whole section is missing, and there's no mention of the need to cut down your study of halacha in order to focus on the needs of the fear of God. No mention of that at all. So I think it's very clear that the change in content and the change in form are the results either of censorship by the printer or by the local authorities of Amsterdam, or maybe Ramchal's self-censorship, we don't know. But somebody told him, you're really skating on thin ice here. You've managed to stay out of trouble as long as you were in Amsterdam. You should continue to keep out of trouble. So maybe now is not a good time to challenge the rabbinic establishment and to tell people that they shouldn't be learning as much halacha as they're learning. You could just make your point without saying that. And that's what he does. But you can see from the fact that there's no section of Mesilat Yesharim called Torah, even though that is the first stage in the price of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, that something has gone awry here. Something is missing that almost ought to be there. So there's something very, very strange about that. Let me pause here and see if people have any comments or questions.
Paul, I got a question.
Yes.
I'm wondering, you talked about kind of the perush of Mesilat Yesharim, and kind of how different interpretations developed, especially among musar yeshivot in Eastern Europe. I'm wondering, but I feel like there was a gap between the time when he died and the establishment of those musar yeshivot. So I'm wondering whether you can spend a couple of minutes or less than a minute kind of seeing how it was received when it came out and how it ended up in that world.
Sure. There is a little bit of a time gap. I'm not sure if people can hear me now. It looks frozen. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you froze, but
okay.
you're back.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're back.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a time gap, but only if until his recognition by the Vilna Gaon, there's not that long. I mean, they lived at the same time, although the Vilna Gaon is younger. So I think he was already recognized to some extent. And Mesilat Yesharim is one of the most printed Hebrew books of the 18th, 19th century. I can't tell you exactly how many times, but it's printed many times. Now, there was some tension in the 19th century over its use, not about the book itself, but Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, of course, famously believed that the Talmud curriculum of the new yeshivas that were started under the influence of the Vilna Gaon, starting in Volozhin, but Mir is pretty early as well. The curriculum of focusing on Talmud was great, but not sufficient. One also needed to focus on fear of God and musar, the exact same argument that the Mesilat Yesharim makes in the omitted section of the book. And in a way, that goes all the way back to much earlier works like Bachya ibn Pakuda's Chovas Halavavos, the duties of the heart. It's an old argument, but this was resisted by some of the teachers in the yeshivas. And at first, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter dealt with this by establishing his own chain of study halls, which were devoted particularly to the study of musar, so that you can go to one base medrash to study the regular things and go to another one to study musar, and he won't interfere with them. Eventually, and it's a long story that I won't get into, the yeshiva world accepted the need for people to teach musar. I think politically, the reason for that is that the yeshivas were fighting against the haskalah. They were fighting against the enlightenment, and I mean, I'm talking about in the Russian Empire during the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century. They had serious troubles with student discipline, and it was decided that to have a mashgiach ruchani, a spiritual supervisor, was a good thing from the point of view of student discipline. Many yeshivas really never accepted the idea that there should be serious study of musar, but they liked the idea that someone should be in charge of discipline. That's my short answer to the question. Some yeshivas are very committed to musar. Others will do a little musar seder between Mincha and Mariv or something like that, and it's really perfunctory. But I happen to have grown up in a place where it was taken very seriously, and where the Litvischer yeshivas were sort of transplanted. So that's where I got started on this. Okay, I'm almost done with the slides, but let me just go back and then we can have another question in a minute. Okay. Now, I think that one can characterize Ramchal's general view as what I've called in print kabbalistic humanism. And I think this is a general worldview that, broadly speaking, is shared by both Jewish and Christian Kabbalists, starting in the Renaissance. And it's characterized in the following way. What deserves primary attention, is neither the halacha nor the cosmos, the natural world, but the human. That's what makes it a kind of humanism. That's why Italians talk about humanism and so on. And the famous essay on the dignity of man by Pico della Mirandola is very much influenced by his kabbalistic study. But what's meant by the human here is essentially the spherotic structure that characterizes both individual humans and the manifestations of God, the ways in which we encounter divinity. So there's a sort of an isomorphism between the human and the divine. Very important emphasis is put on freedom of the will. And you can see this if you look at Ramchal's other writings, not so much Mesilat Yesharim, where it's presupposed, but explicitly in some of his other writings. Freedom of the will is possessed only by humans among all the creatures. And as he puts it in the printed version, this is what makes all worldly affairs, fortunate or unfortunate, into trials. Right? There wouldn't be a trial, an isayon, unless human beings were free to act in one way or another. So that, as he puts it in the manuscript, humans are in the midst of a fierce battle. And that's very much the picture of human life that you get in all of the Ramchal's works, and in Mesilat Yesharim in particular, and it presupposes freedom of the will. Now, freedom of the will here is understood in a very particular way, and I mean not just by Ramchal, but by all of the kabbalistic humanists. It is freedom that consists in having an indeterminate nature. Human beings do not have a determinate nature, and this is unique to human beings. We can be greater than the angels themselves. That's what Ramchal says in the printed version, or we can be worse than the worst creatures. And Pico della Mirandola says the exact same thing in his famous treatise on the dignity of man. Right? So humans are the only ones who have an indeterminate, or maybe you should say a determinable nature. That's going to make a big difference, because for most creatures, there's a determinate nature that they have, and it is the character of things to seek their own perfection. What counts as a creature's perfection will be determined by its nature. But if human beings have a determinable nature, then they can't just look at their own nature and say, this is the way I should be, I should become perfect. They don't have a natural law in that sense at all. Now, there's at this point in kabbalistic humanism a divergence between Jewish and Christian versions. And Christian versions tend to focus on the universal, although it may be a version of the universal that is only available to spiritual elitists or something like that. Jewish versions tend to focus on particular Jewish rituals, and especially on the Hebrew language and practices involving the Hebrew language, the contemplation of different letters and words and so on. Now, of course, in Mesilat Yesharim, Ramchal is addressing a Jewish audience, but there's something universal about what he's saying, because since he's not writing for Kabbalists specifically, he doesn't focus on the details of Jewish practice, let alone of Kabbalistic ritual. So it's a very widely accessible book, and it's written that way deliberately, but it comes from the worldview of Kabbalistic humanism. The human is the purpose of the world. And I think the most important point that he makes in this first section of the book is that the Torah is an alternative to tragedy. Now, the way he puts this in the manuscript version is a bit different from the printed version. The printed version simply spells out what his view is. The manuscript view has two different views arguing against one another. So in the manuscript, the first view is human perfection is something that is situated within this world. Creation was created for whatever reason, independent of us. And we are here primarily to enjoy it. But we need the mitzvahs. Why? Because human nature can very easily be corrupted. So mitzvahs set limits on the way we act in order to prevent us from being corrupted, so that we can enjoy the natural world, which was created for whatever divine purpose, independently of us. I don't think anyone has succeeded so far in identifying anyone who actually holds that view, but that's the view that Ramchal argues against. So what's the alternative to that? The alternative is that human perfection is not something that lies within this world. It is otherworldly. Creation was created for a reason dependent on the human. We are the ultimate culmination of creation. And the primary purpose of humanity is, by means of creation, to achieve dveikus, that is to say, cleaving to God, to divinity. Now, this will be the highest pleasure, to which any earthly pleasure is incomparable. And we cannot achieve this goal without this worldly mitzvahs. So that's the humanistic view as he understands it, the kabbalist humanist view. The world is created for human beings, but so that human beings can achieve their perfection beyond the world. And mitzvahs are means to that goal. In the printed version, as I said, he argues for the second view, but he doesn't argue against the first, which he never mentions. And he spends far less time giving traditional sources. He just gives what you might call a rational argument. And he basically argues, look, if human perfection were this worldly, then our lives would be tragic because we'd be doomed to failure. And here's the key passage from the printed version. For what is man's life in this world? Who is really happy and tranquil in this world? For 70 is the sum of our years, 80 if we're strong, and at their best they are but toil and sorrow, with all sorts of distress and sickness, pain and troubles, and after all that, death. Not 1 out of 1,000 is to be found to whom the world offers copious pleasures and true tranquility. And even he, if he reaches the age of 100, is as one who has already passed away and departed the world. So fundamentally, we are mortal, our bodies age, and it's almost impossible, or maybe actually impossible, to attain a lasting happiness in this world. We're not set up for that. So either we could say that the first view is true, human perfection is this worldly, but our bodies were created in such a way that we're going to end up being miserable and mortal. Or you could say the second view is true, in which case this is all a trial, but it makes sense and it's totally compatible with our attaining perfection and tranquility, however, not in this world, but in the next world. I think the argument is very similar to Maimonides, to Rambam's in the Guide of the Perplexed, though there are very important differences. Rambam presents human beings as internally and externally divided by their material embodiment in such a way that their perfection cannot be this worldly. Only an otherworldly Torah with an otherworldly goal can help us escape tragedy. Now, having said that, there is a difference between the Rambam's view and the Ramchal's. For Rambam, the way to achieve perfection is purely intellectual and involves the transcendence of the body. For Ramchal, that is not the case. Now, we'll notice that if we go back to the very beginning, and this is my last slide, Torah is what then? Well, if it's nothing but the practice and study of ways of limiting human corruption, it does not lead anywhere. But Rabbi Pinchas Ben Yair thought it does lead somewhere. So that's the view that we need to adopt, right? Mitzvahs are not merely hedges against corruption. They are means to spiritual refinement, which lead ultimately to human perfection. In the words of Rabbi Yerucham, the Mashgiach of Mir, Malchus leads ultimately to Yichud, right? The Torah leads ultimately to Dveikus, to unity with God. As I said, there's much in common here with Rambam, but also important differences. Now, notice that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair in the Brisa has things culminating in Techiyas HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead. The first Maimonidean controversy was about the resurrection of the dead. Of course, Rambam says he affirms the resurrection of the dead. It's a required dogma. You have to believe it. But it's very difficult for him to accommodate within his worldview. The culmination of spiritual refinement on the Rambam's view is disembodied intellectual perfection. At the end of your life, you succeed in completely transcending the body. And how does God reward you? By putting you right back in the body again with Techiyas HaMesim. It's a little hard to understand. And I think it's clear that Ramchal has a different view. Human perfection is the tikkun, the rectification of the human body properly understood in accordance with its spherotic structure. It's not purely intellectual. So I think that that's a really fundamental difference, and we're going to want to pay attention to the hints that Ramchal gives us in his work about how we are to embody human perfection, not just to attain it intellectually in the way that Rambam said. Okay, let me pause there for questions. Yeah, Karin?
Thanks, Paul. So I have a question about how to understand the freedom of the will that is at the heart of kabbalistic humanism. So one way in which you put that is the idea that human beings do not have a determinate nature. And as you mentioned, Pico de la Mirandola explains a similar idea in his book on the dignity of man. Many people read that as, very similar to the existentialist idea that existence precedes essence. But it seems that that's not really what is being said here, right? Because there is a pretty specific idea of what human perfection involves. And so I'm wondering what really the idea that human nature is not determinate amounts to, if there is a pretty specific idea of what human perfection involves.
Right. So there is a very good idea of what human perfection involves, but it's an idea that comes from the Torah and through revelation. Oh, yeah.
Go ahead and off your video.
Okay, you're back, but whatever.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about
You're
that.
back. So just-
Yeah. Okay. So I was going to say that and it's human nature, insofar as it's something that you can inspect philosophically, does not give you any understanding of human perfection that is attainable. What gives you an understanding of human perfection is revelation. So that's very different from the sort of secular existentialist picture, where philosophical inspection of the human is the only way you could know anything. But it has to be through the Torah. I mean, that's partly the Rambam's argument as well, that we have to have a divine law that comes from a perspective that transcends the human if we are to understand how to attain human perfection. And as I say, I think Ramchal has the same picture, except that for him, perfection does not consist in overcoming the body, but in rectifying the body. Yeah, Joel?
Thank you so much, Paul, for the shiur tonight. I'm wondering, when you're talking about this perfected spherotic body, human spherotic body, what exactly the nature of that body is? Is it a physical body? Is it a spiritualized body? Because to a certain extent, if it's a idealized, spiritualized version of the body that is a manifestation of the Sphirot, in some ways, perhaps it's not actually that different from the Rambam's. To whatever extent the Rambam would affirm in an allegorical sense, Tchiyat HaMeitim, that, okay, so it's got there's 10 aspects in here. It's one aspect, but what's the nafkamina? Yeah,
okay, sure. That's it. It's a great question. We're lucky to have Joel Hecker with us, who's much more of an expert on Kabbalah than I am. So I don't I think we're going to get just some little hints and clues about that in Mesilat Yesharim, and one would have to look at Ramchal's sort of more sort of kabbalistic works to get a sense of it. But first of all, I don't think it's going to be purely intellectual. So that's one thing. It's going to involve the emotions. It's going to involve eros and other things that the Rambam's purely intellectual conjunction with the intelligibles will not involve. But you're right that a spiritualized body, which I think is a traditional kabbalistic understanding of Kehilah of Riverdale. It's not just return to the regular body. Nachmanides already talks about that in objecting to the Rambam. But yeah, once you spiritualize these things, it's true that it's not, strictly speaking, physical. That is true. So how much difference does that make? But I think the sort of the experience of piety in the book, that's why I call this series embodied piety, is meant to go a bit differently. Now, Ramchal is an allegorical reader of Kabbalah. So there is going to be, he is not one of the people who will emphasize the literal physicality. And I'm not going to say more about that now, but there are some people who might do that a lot more than he would. But he interprets Kabbalah itself in an allegorical way. So that makes him closer to a philosophical reader, even though he is opposed to philosophy in the sense that he thinks Kabbalah is a higher discipline. But thank you for the question. Yeah. Rabbi Nyman.
So insofar as the initial Breita that you mentioned influences the Ramchal, and I guess is maybe a directive for the Ramchal, how does he see Chassidut then? Is because Chassidut in the level of, it seems like it's actually at the bottom rung, not at the top rung. Well, unless you view Chesed differently from Chassidut, it seems like from the Breita, Chassidut was the ultimate. Does he see that point as a springboard to greater heights, or does he flip it to some extent? And does Chassidut become something else? That's number one. And to tag onto that, given some of the other questions that you just received about the physicality, is Chassidut something we always thought is something that's not void of physicality? Is that something also that drives the Ramchal to kind of merge the physicality with the spiritual?
Okay, great. So obviously we can't really answer these questions until we get to that part of the book, but we can already see, if we look at the Brisa and look at the correspondence with the Spheres, that Hasidus is going to be a central notion, right? So the Brisa ends by saying that Hasidus is the most important thing. And in Ramchal's own presentation in the dialogical form, it's a chassid, a pious person, speaking to a chacham or a wise person, and it's clearly the chassid who is speaking for Ramchal. So whatever chassidus exactly means, it will clearly play a very central role in his account of the book. And whatever chesed is, loving kindness, it's not. Oh. Okay. Sorry, can you hear me?
Sorry.
Okay. So I'm just saying whatever chesed. What?
Keep going. Whatever.
Can't hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay, what I'm saying, whatever chesed is, loving kindness, it's going to have an emotional dimension that is not reducible to the intellectual.
Right.
And that's going to play a very central role in Ramchal's account of the pursuit of human perfection. Okay, I think we should probably stop there. I'm sorry that the connection failed us a few times. I'm happy to share my slides with anybody who wants them. I could, let's see. Yeah. I can send them to people. And otherwise, I think we'll resume the second part of the book and look at the first triad next Wednesday at 8 o'clock. Thank you all for coming here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you all. Okay, bye-bye.
Yeshikayach. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Professor. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.